Hello. On a sunny May morning, Ulyana left her house, her heart racing as she walked briskly toward the train station. She hadn't slept the night before, her mind consumed with thoughts of seeing her beloved Denis again. Today, at last, he was coming home from the army, and her anticipation was overwhelming. The station was bustling, but Ulyana moved through the crowd without seeing anyone around her. Her gaze was fixed in the distance, as if she could catch a glimpse of Denis before anyone else. Then, suddenly, she heard a familiar voice call her name, Yulia. She spun around, and there he was. Denis stood nearby, smiling warmly. Without a second thought, she rushed toward him and threw her arms around him, overcome with emotion. "You're finally back," she whispered, unable to hold back her tears of joy. Denis stroked her hair gently. "I'm sorry for making you wait," he replied softly. "But I kept my promise. I'm here now." They held each other tightly, standing still as if trying to make up for the months they had been apart. After some time, they began walking through the nearby park, sharing stories of all that had happened in their lives since they'd last seen each other. Ulyana talked about her studies, her friends, and all the small, bright moments she'd experienced in his absence, her voice brimming with happiness just to be near him again. Denis listened, his eyes shining with warmth as he soaked in her joy. When she asked him about his service, he admitted it had been hard, but he thought of her every day. They strolled down to a quiet pond and fell silent, both looking out over the water as the sunlight danced on its surface. Breaking the silence, Ulyana whispered, "I'm so happy. Thank you for coming back to me." Denis turned to her, looking into her eyes with sincerity. "I love you, Ulyana. I'll never leave you." They shared a tender, unhurried kiss, the culmination of all the love and longing that had built up during their separation. Denis's return had restored Ulyana's faith in their future together, and as they stood side by side, they felt ready to begin a new chapter in their lives, one filled with dreams and promises of a life they would share. With Denis back home, Ulyana's days felt brighter, filled with a renewed sense of purpose. Their reunion had strengthened her confidence that they were meant to build a future together. As the weeks passed, she grew accustomed to having him by her side again, and they began making plans for their life as a couple. They spent every moment they could together, exploring the town, reminiscing about the memories they'd created, and envisioning what lay ahead. Denis talked excitedly about finding work, setting down roots, and eventually starting a family. Ulyana felt a sense of comfort in these plans, warmed by the idea of a stable, shared life. But, over time, Ulyana began to notice subtle changes in Denis. Some nights he would grow quiet, his gaze distant, as if lost in thoughts he couldn't put into words. When she asked if something was wrong, he would smile and brush it off, saying he was just tired from adjusting to civilian life again. Still, his unease lingered in small ways. Sometimes, during their conversations, she'd catch him gazing at her with an expression that was both loving and guarded, as if he were holding back part of himself. His easy laughter from before his service was now tempered with a quiet seriousness she didn't fully recognize. One evening, as they walked hand in hand through the park, Ulyana gathered the courage to ask him directly, "Denis, is there something you're not telling me? I feel like there's a part of you that's somewhere else." He stopped walking and looked down, his expression conflicted. After a moment, he replied softly, "It's hard to explain, Ulyana. I'm happy to be here with you, more than you can imagine. But there are things I went through in the army, things that changed me. Sometimes, it's hard to let them go." Ulyana tightened her grip on his hand, determined to reassure him. "Denis, whatever you've been through, we'll get through it together. You're not alone anymore." He nodded, pulling her close and pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Thank you, Yulia. I don't know what I'd do without you." They continued their walk in silence, each lost in their thoughts. Ulyana realized that loving Denis meant accepting not only his joy but also his pain. Though they had both longed for his return, she understood now that reintegrating back into each other's lives might be more complicated than they had anticipated. As the days turned into weeks, Ulyana became increasingly aware of the unspoken distance between her and Denis. Though he was physically present, there were moments where his mind seemed miles away, trapped in memories that he couldn't share. He began staying out later with friends, spending nights drinking and retreating further into himself. Ulyana tried to be understanding, but it was hard to ignore the growing tension between them. One evening, Denis came home smelling of alcohol, his mood unusually somber. Ulyana, concerned, approached him gently. "Denis, I'm worried about you," she said softly, placing a hand on his arm. "It feels like you're struggling with something, and I want to help." He looked at her, his expression a mix of frustration and sorrow. "You wouldn't understand, Yulia," he said, pulling away. "Some things are too hard to talk about." Ulyana felt a pang in her heart. She wanted to be there for him, to ease the weight of whatever he was carrying. But his silence made her feel helpless, as if she were reaching out to someone she could no longer grasp. "Denis, please. I'm here. You don't have to go through this alone," she urged, her voice barely above a whisper. Denis sighed heavily, his shoulders slumping as he sat down, running a hand over his face. "I know you're here, Yulia. And I love you for it. But there are things I've seen, things I've done, that you wouldn't want to know about." The pain in his voice was unmistakable, and Ulyana's heart broke for him. She took a seat beside him, wrapping her arms around his shoulders, offering comfort without words. Denis leaned into her embrace, but she could feel the emotional wall he'd built around himself, a barrier that kept her at a painful distance. In the following days, Denis continued to retreat further, becoming more withdrawn and restless. Ulyana did her best to support him, hoping that time would help him heal. Yet, despite her love and patience, she felt a growing ache in her heart, a fear that Denis's experiences had changed him in ways that even she couldn't fully reach. Ulyana's concern for Denis grew as his once mild withdrawal deepened into something heavier, almost unreachable. He became distant, irritable, and often left without explanation, returning at odd hours. Nights that were once filled with laughter and shared dreams became cold and quiet, marked by his long absences and the distance between them. One evening, after yet another late return, Ulyana decided she could no longer remain silent. As he walked through the door, avoiding her gaze, she confronted him, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and worry. "Denis, I can't keep pretending everything is fine. You're not the same person who came back to me." Denis looked at her, the weariness in his eyes clear, but he said nothing, as if he were too exhausted to respond. Ulyana pressed on, unable to hold back her feelings any longer. "I've been patient, I've tried to give you space, but I can't do this alone. I feel like I'm losing you, and I don't know why." Denis exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "It's not you, Yulia," he replied, his voice hollow. "It's everything else. The things I went through, they changed me. And no matter how much I want to leave it all behind, it doesn't just disappear." She took a step closer, reaching for his hand. "Then let me help you. Whatever it is, we can get through it together." He shook his head, his expression conflicted. "I don't want to drag you into this darkness, Ulyana. You deserve someone who can give you happiness, not this." Her heart sank at his words, the resignation in his tone cutting deeply. "Denis, I don't want anyone else. I chose you, for better or worse. But you have to let me in. We can't build a future on secrets and silence." They stood there in the dim light of the room, a heavy silence hanging between them. Denis seemed torn, as though he wanted to open up, but couldn't find the words. Finally, he pulled her into an embrace, holding her tightly, as if afraid to let go. "I'm trying, Yulia. I really am," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "But it's harder than I thought." Ulyana held him, her heart aching with a mix of love and helplessness. She knew that whatever he was facing, it was something he had to confront in his own time. Yet, she also knew that their relationship could only withstand so much strain before the cracks began to deepen. Despite her continued support, Ulyana sensed that Denis was slipping further away, pulled into a darkness she couldn't reach. He became secretive, frequently disappearing without notice and returning with vague excuses that only fueled her suspicions. The growing distance between them felt insurmountable, and Ulyana's concern turned into quiet desperation as she realized her love alone might not be enough to save him. One evening, after Denis had left abruptly again, Ulyana found herself pacing their small apartment, anxiety gnawing at her. Without fully knowing why, she found herself checking his things, hoping for some clue that would explain his recent behavior. She didn't expect to find anything incriminating, she only hoped for a glimpse into the world he was keeping from her. In the pocket of his jacket, she found a crumpled slip of paper, a receipt from a bar on the far side of town. The time was marked well past midnight on a weekday. Her heart raced as she scanned the details, each piece adding to the mystery. Why would he be out drinking in such a distant place, and why had he lied about it? The questions plagued her until he returned late that night, his face showing signs of exhaustion, his mood withdrawn. She couldn't hold back any longer. Holding up the receipt, she looked at him with a mixture of betrayal and heartbreak. "Denis, what's going on? Why are you hiding things from me? Where have you really been going?" Denis's face fell, his shoulders slumping as he realized he'd been caught. He hesitated, his mouth opening and closing as though he was searching for an explanation he didn't know how to give. Finally, he muttered, "I didn't want you to find out this way." Her heart pounded in her chest. "Find out what, Denis? What are you keeping from me?" Taking a deep breath, he admitted, "I've been struggling with everything since I came back. I thought I could handle it, but sometimes I feel like I can't breathe. I started going out to clear my head, but it got out of control." Tears stung her eyes as she absorbed his words. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you shut me out? I didn't want you to see me like this," he whispered, guilt evident in his voice. "I didn't want you to know how weak I felt." She stepped closer, her voice gentle but firm. "Denis, we're supposed to face things together. That's what love is. I'm not here to judge you, I'm here to help you, if you'll let me." For the first time, she saw a flicker of hope in his eyes. He nodded, his walls beginning to crumble. "I don't know if I can do this alone, Yulia. I need help, but I didn't know how to ask." With that, they embraced, the weight of their unspoken fears shared for the first time. Ulyana knew that the road to healing would be long and uncertain, but for the first time, she felt that they might have a chance to face it together. With the truth out in the open, Ulyana and Denis faced a new chapter together, one defined by honesty and vulnerability. Denis, relieved of his burden, agreed to seek help for his struggles, understanding that he could no longer face his pain in isolation. Ulyana found herself both anxious and hopeful. She knew healing would take time, but for the first time in months, she felt they were truly on the same path. In the following days, they sought counseling, a step Denis had never considered before. Therapy sessions became a safe space for him to confront his memories, his regrets, and the lingering trauma from his service. Ulyana attended a few sessions with him, offering quiet support, listening, and learning about the complexities he'd been holding inside. She found strength in their shared commitment to work through it all, and for Denis, having her by his side made the difficult process a little more bearable. With each session, Denis grew more at ease, opening up not just about his past, but also his hopes for their future. He began to make peace with the parts of himself he'd hidden for so long, allowing Ulyana to truly see him. Their relationship, once defined by unspoken fears, slowly transformed into one of shared resilience. One evening, after a particularly heartfelt conversation, Denis took Ulyana's hand and said, "Thank you for believing in me, even when I couldn't believe in myself. I know I put you through so much, but you're the reason I didn't give up." She squeezed his hand, her heart swelling with love and relief. "We're in this together, Denis. No matter what." In time, Denis found himself becoming more grounded, rebuilding the parts of his life that had once seemed irreparably fractured. He began working again, slowly finding joy in everyday moments and in the life they were building together. Their nights, once filled with silence and distance, became moments of shared laughter, quiet dinners, and dreams of the future. Months later, Denis and Ulyana stood in the same park where they had reunited, looking out over the pond as the sun set. This time, their hearts were unburdened, their bond strengthened by everything they had overcome. They knew challenges would come and go, but they had faced the darkest parts of themselves and emerged stronger, side by side. As they walked hand in hand, Ulyana felt a deep sense of peace. She realized that love wasn't just about the joyful moments, it was about weathering the storms, facing the shadows, and choosing each other over and over again. Together, they had chosen a path forward, one filled with hope, resilience, and a love that had proven itself unbreakable. Bye-bye.